Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the world of a true comedic legend, George Carlin, and we're going way beyond, just his stand-up routines.
Absolutely. We're going to be uncovering the man behind the mic, the philosophies and anxieties that fueled his comedic genius. Think of it as a multifaceted exploration of George Carlin. The man, the thinker, the provocateur.
I love that. And to guide us on this journey, we've got a treasure trove of sources. We're talking Carlin's own books, a biography written by his daughter, Kelly, and an incredibly detailed deep dive into his life and work by John Corcelli.
Yeah, having these different perspectives is going to give us such a rich understanding of Carlin, not just the punchlines, but the person who crafted them, like what shaped his worldview, what were his influences. It's all here waiting to be unearthed.
So let's rewind all the way back to Carlin's childhood. We're talking pre-fame George soaking up the world around him. One thing that really struck me in John Corcelli's book was this anecdote about a young Carlin completely captivated by radio personalities. He would spend hours mimicking their voices, trying to capture every inflection and nuance.
It's fascinating how those seemingly trivial childhood interests can actually be formative, isn't it? It's like he was already honing his craft, developing that mastery of language and sound that would become so central to his comedy.
Yeah, and then there's the story of his mom gifting him a reel-to-reel tape recorder at 13, his very own home studio where he could experiment with sounds and stories, talk about a pivotal moment.
Absolutely. That tape recorder became his creative outlet, a space to play and explore. It makes you wonder, what if he hadn't received that gift? Would his path have been different? It really underscores the power of nurturing creativity in young people.
But of course, Carlin's childhood wasn't all sunshine and roses. His father passed away when he was just 8 years old, and he had a somewhat complicated relationship with his mother.
Right. These early experiences with loss and difficult family dynamics likely played a role in shaping his worldview, particularly his distrust of authority figures, which became a recurring theme in his comedy.
And let's not forget the influence of other comedians, particularly Mort Saul Corcelli, really emphasizes how Saul's intelligent humor and willingness to challenge mainstream ideas resonated deeply with Carlin.
Yeah, Saul was a pioneer of social commentary through comedy. He wasn't just telling jokes, he was making people think, using humor to spark critical thinking. And that approach clearly had a profound impact on Carlin, especially as he began to develop his own comedic voice.
It's really remarkable to see how these early influences, both positive and negative, shaped the comedian he would become. It's like we're starting to peel back the layers and understand the depth beneath those iconic jokes.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this exploration so captivating. It's not just about recounting Carlin's career, it's about understanding the forces that shaped his unique perspective on the world.
Now, speaking of Carlin's career, we know he started out in a fairly traditional comedy duo. Think sharp suits, clean-cut jokes, a far cry from the rebellious Carlin we know and love.
Right. But even then, those early years were crucial for him to hone his craft. John Corcelli even talks about this character. Carlin developed Willie West, this over-the-top radio DJ persona. It's fascinating to see those vocal talents we talked about earlier already on full display, even in those early days.
He was clearly talented, but as you read through the sources, you get this sense that he was yearning for something more. Like he was feeling constrained by the safe, predictable humor of his early act. He wanted to push boundaries, challenge conventions, be something more than just a guy telling jokes in a suit.
And that's where Lenny Bruce and Paul Krasner enter the picture. These guys were radical, no-hold-barred comedians. They weren't afraid to use humor to tackle social issues head-on, to push the envelope, to challenge authority. They embodied the spirit of the counterculture movement.
And their influence on Carlin was undeniable. They helped him to shed that straight-laced persona and embrace a more authentic, more controversial voice, and boy, did he embrace it.
It was a deliberate shift toward counterculture comedy, and it culminated in what's arguably his most infamous routine, the 7 words you can never say on television.
Oh, yeah. That routine was a game changer. It wasn't just Carlin being provocative for the sake of it. It was a direct challenge to censorship, a statement about freedom of expression. And it sparked a nationwide debate about language comedy and the limits of what's considered acceptable.
It's amazing to think how one routine could have such a massive impact, not just on Carlin's career, but on the cultural landscape as a whole. And it all stemmed from his willingness to push boundaries, to challenge the status quo, to use humor as a weapon against hypocrisy and societal norms.
And what's so striking is that he wasn't afraid to alienate some of his audience in the process. He was willing to risk it all, to stay true to his comedic vision, to say what he believed needed to be said, even if it meant ruffling some feathers.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most impactful art comes from pushing boundaries from challenging the status quo. It's about making people think, making them uncomfortable, making them question what they believe, and Carlin was a master of that.
I think that's what makes him such an enduring figure. He wasn't just a comedian. He was a cultural commentator, a philosopher, disguised as a stand-up comic. And as his career progressed, he delved even deeper into the human condition, exploring topics like death, suffering, and the absurdity of our societal responses to these issues.
And we're going to get into that in more detail. But first, we want to remind you that if you're enjoying this deep dive, please like, subscribe, and share this episode. Help us spread the word and bring these thought-provoking conversations to a wider audience. You can also join the Allison Knows community on YouTube and Spotify. We're all about sharing these deep dives and sparking those aha moments.
All right, because this is just the beginning of our exploration.
Yeah.
We're about to get into some of Carlin's most thought-provoking and, dare I say, controversial material. But before we do, let's take a moment to appreciate how far he'd come from mimicking radio personalities as a child to becoming this countercultural icon. It's a truly remarkable journey.
It really is, and it speaks to the power of passion, of finding your voice, and of being unafraid to use it even if it means challenging the world around you.
Now, are you ready to dive into the darker, more philosophical side of George Carlin? Because it's about to get really interesting.
Let's do it. All right, so let's pick up where we left off, delving into Carlin's exploration of life's bigger questions like death and suffering.
Yeah, and he did it with such a unique blend of humor and insight.
Yeah.
Like, take his bits about the overprotection of children.
Mm-hmm.
It's dark, it's morbid, but it's also hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
He had this whole routine about traffic accidents and how we react to them.
I think what he was doing there was pointing out the absurdity of it all. Like, we try so hard to shield ourselves from the realities of death and suffering, but it's all around us. He wasn't glorifying these things, but rather using humor to confront our own anxieties and societal responses to these uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, and it wasn't just death. He also had a lot to say about organized religion, especially the concept of the sanctity of life. He was very skeptical.
Yeah, he was a master at dissecting the contradictions and hypocrisies he saw within organized religion. He had this incredible bit where he reimagines like an interview with Jesus, questioning the whole resurrection story, and it's just brilliant. It's not about attacking faith itself, but rather encouraging people to critically examine what they believe and why.
And what I find interesting is that he applied this same critical lens to other aspects of society, like the media specifically. He had this whole thing about the way UFOs are treated compared to religious beliefs. Like one is readily dismissed as fantasy while the other is often accepted without question.
Exactly. It all speaks to Carlin's larger point about the power of belief systems and how they shape our perception of reality. He wasn't afraid to poke fun at anything to expose what he saw as flaws and inconsistencies, whether it was religion, politics, or even pop culture.
Speaking of pop culture, we can't forget Carlin's absolute obsession with language. He had these hilarious and insightful critiques of euphemisms in American culture.
Oh, yeah.
And it wasn't just about grammar. It was how language is used to manipulate and control.
One of the best examples of this is his bit about shell shock evolving into operational exhaustion.
Right.
It perfectly illustrates how we use language to sanitize and distance ourselves from uncomfortable realities.
It's like we're constantly trying to find softer, gentler ways to describe things that are inherently difficult or unpleasant. And Carlin saw right through that, calling it out with his trademark wit.
You know, what's interesting here is that he wasn't just complaining about language. He was actually offering a solution. He wanted us to confront reality head on, to call things what they are, no matter how uncomfortable it might feel. It was about honesty and clarity in our communication.
And he did it with such humor. Like, who else could make a bit about the evolution of language into something both hilarious and thought-provoking?
Right.
It takes a certain kind of genius to pull that off.
Absolutely. His comedic genius lay in his ability to make us laugh while simultaneously making us think he wasn't just a comedian, he was a social commentator, a philosopher disguised as a stand-up comic.
Okay, before we get too deep into Carlin's philosophies, we need to talk about his personal life. Kelly Carlin's book provides some incredible insights into his relationship with his family, particularly his wife and daughter. And it adds another layer to our understanding of him, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's important to acknowledge that these personal details are shared by his daughter, so it's her perspective on their family dynamic, but having this added context helps us see the man behind the jokes.
It's clear that Carlin's marriage was far from perfect. His wife Brenda struggled with alcoholism, and there are hints of tension and distance within the family. Do you think these struggles might have influenced his comedic choices, his often cynical and darkly humorous take on life?
It's certainly possible. I mean, art often reflects the artist's life experiences, and for Carlin, who was so deeply observant of human nature, it makes sense that his personal struggles would find their way into his work. But it's also important to remember that we're dealing with a complex individual, and reducing him to just his pain wouldn't do him justice.
Right. And it's not all darkness and cynicism. Kelly also shares some really touching moments. She talks about her father's late-in-life relationship with Sally Wade and how happy she was for him. It's a reminder that personal growth and evolution are always possible.
It's a beautiful testament to the power of love and forgiveness, both for others and for oneself. It reminds us that even someone as seemingly jaded as Carlin could find joy and peace later in life.
So we've got this incredibly complex figure, a brilliant comedian, a social critic, a devoted father, a man grappling with personal demons. It's like each of these sources paints a different facet of who he was.
And by piecing them together, we get a more complete picture, a more nuanced understanding of this extraordinary individual. It's not about idolizing him or glossing over his flaws, but rather appreciating the fullness of his humanity.
It's like assembling a puzzle, each piece revealing something new and enriching the overall image. And this leads us to another important question. What is Carlin's legacy? How does his work continue to resonate with audiences today, decades after his passing?
That's a great question, and I think it's one we'll continue to explore as we move into the final part of our deep dive. But before we do, I want to take a moment to remind our listeners.
Yes, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the world of George Carlin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode. Help us spread the word and bring these fascinating conversations to an even wider audience.
You can also join the Allison Knows community on YouTube and Spotify, where we're always sharing these thought-provoking deep dives and sparking those aha moments.
All right, now, are you ready to explore Carlin's lasting impact and how his insights still resonate today? Because we're about to unpack some truly fascinating connections between his work and the world we live in now. So we've journeyed through George Carlin's life, his comedy, his philosophies. But what does it all mean for us today? Why should we care about the musings of a comedian who's no longer with us?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? And I think the answer lies in Carlin's enduring relevance. Like, his comedy wasn't just about entertainment, it was about engagement. He wanted to make you think, to challenge your assumptions, to provoke you into questioning the world around you. And in today's world where we're bombarded with information and opinions from every direction, that skill, that critical thinking is more valuable than ever.
Yeah, you're so right. It's like he was giving us a toolkit for navigating this increasingly complex world. He was saying, don't take anything at face value, question everything, and hey, don't forget to find the humor in the absurdity of it all. It's a message that feels incredibly timely.
Think about his critiques of consumerism, for example. He was talking about the ways we're bombarded with advertising and manipulated by marketing tactics decades ago, long before the rise of social media and the 24/7 news cycle. Yet his observations are even more relevant now, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's not just consumerism. His bits about euphemisms and the way language is used to control and manipulate us are incredibly relevant in today's world of political spin and carefully crafted messaging.
He was teaching us to be media literate, to decode the messages we're being bombarded with, to look beyond the surface and ask who benefits from this message. What are they trying to get me to believe?
And he did it all with humor, which makes it so much more palatable than a dry lecture on media manipulation. He could make you laugh while simultaneously opening your eyes to the ways in which you're being influenced.
Yeah, it's a powerful combination. Laughter disarms you, it makes you receptive, and then bam, he hits you with this profound insight that makes you rethink your entire worldview. It's no wonder his comedy continues to resonate with audiences across generations.
Yeah, I think that's what makes him such an important figure, not just in the world of comedy, but in our culture as a whole. He was a voice of dissent, a champion for free speech and critical thinking, at a time when those values are increasingly under threat.
Right. He challenged us to be more aware, more critical, more engaged with the world around us. He encouraged us to question authority, to challenge dogma, to think for ourselves.
And he reminded us that even in the face of absurdity and injustice, there's always room for laughter. It's not about ignoring the problems or being apathetic. It's about finding the humor in the midst of the chaos, using laughter as a coping mechanism, as a way to stay sane in an insane world.
Carlin's legacy is multifaceted. He was a comedic genius, a social critic, a philosopher, and as Kelly Carlin's book reveals, a complex and sometimes flawed human being. But at the core of it all, he was a truth seeker, someone who used humor to illuminate the human experience in all its messy, complicated glory.
And in a world that often feels increasingly divided and polarized, I think that's a message we all need to hear.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's circle back to you, the listener. What are your takeaways? What resonated with you most from our exploration of Carlin's life and work?
Because ultimately, the goal of this deep dive isn't just to tell you about George Carlin, it's to inspire you to think critically, to engage with the world around you in a more meaningful way.
Carlin was fascinated by language, by the ways in which it shapes our perceptions and influences our behavior. So here's a challenge for you. You pay attention to the language you encounter every day. What are the euphemisms, the buzzwords, the carefully crafted phrases designed to manipulate your emotions or beliefs?
It's an exercise in awareness, in becoming a more critical consumer of information, and it's something Carlin would have definitely approved of.
You probably have a hilarious bit about it, too.
Oh, absolutely. So, as we say goodbye to the world of George Carlin, we want to leave you with one final thought. Don't be afraid to question everything. Challenge the status quo. Think for yourself, and above all, don't lose your sense of humor.
Because, as Carlin so brilliantly demonstrated, laughter can be a powerful tool for change, for enlightenment, and for making the world a slightly less absurd place.
And before we sign off, we want to remind you that if you enjoyed this deep dive, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Help us spread the word and bring these thought-provoking conversations to an even wider audience.
You can also join the Allison Knows community on YouTube and Spotify, where we're always exploring fascinating topics and encouraging critical thinking.
Thank you for listening to the Allison Knows podcast.
Keep questioning, keep laughing, and keep those minds engaged.
Follow Allison on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok.